Austin. This is good. Hello, guys. Have you gotten your coffee today? Okay, so you're not going to let me just sit here and talk for like the next 30 or 45 minutes? You'll answer some questions and stuff? Maybe. Well, thanks for coming today. My name is Marissa Mann. I work with Regenerative Life Sciences, which is a nutrient manufacturing company. And when I was reached out to be their regenerative ag talk specialist of the day, I said absolutely, because what I went to school for was actually agronomy soil science. I have some family that owns an agricultural laboratory in McCook, Nebraska. So the soil science spectrum of this is really where my heart has always lied. I find that fascinating. And that was one thing when I started my career as a field agronomist in South Central and North Central Nebraska. I was like, this is phenomenal, but not a lot of people understand that there's actually a lot that goes on in the soil, right? You just kind of think of it as dirt. And that's definitely not the case. So I said, absolutely, I would love to come and visit with you guys and try and tackle the regenerative ag topic, because there is a lot to it. So please, I know I'm a redhead. I am very friendly. You can just don't ask my husband, okay? He might disagree with you guys, but yeah, please ask questions. So the first slide that I wanted to cover is just some statistics. So the first one is 92%. Does anybody want to take a stab at what any of these numbers might mean? Some with fertilizer? So the 92% is of the whole state of Nebraska. That's what's dedicated to production agriculture. So 3 tons per acre is the amount of soil estimated to be lost annually due to erosion. And I know where I live at, up in northeastern Nebraska, earlier this winter, we definitely didn't have any wind erosion happening in our soil, right? It kind of looked like a scene out of the Dust Bowl, right? The dirty 30s. There were times when you would look out your window and you couldn't see across the road because of all the blowing snow. So they actually have been able to put a number to this, and that's that 3 tons per acre of soil lost every year. The 1 teaspoon, 1 billion, and 10,000. Does anybody have a guess on what that might be? Pretty quiet. So that is the amount of soil microorganisms there are in 1 teaspoon of soil. I am an ag girl. I'm not a great cook or a great baker, right? My mom is one of those people that can go, oh, that looks like about a teaspoon, right? That is not a lot of soil. Did any of you guys realize that there were upwards of 1 billion different microbes in that small amount of soil? So the next question is, what do they all do, right? Because that's a lot of living organisms in a very small space. So 1/3, that is the number of the world's farmland that is moderate to highly degraded. And that ties back into that 3 tons per acre of soil that we lose annually due to soil erosion. 9.7 billion. Any guesses? You guys are quiet. Nothing? So this is the forecasted population by 2050. That is an obscene amount of people. And if we're losing 3 tons per acre of our high-producing soil every year, that poses a really big question of how are we going to feed all these people? And then 30 million acres, that is the amount of acres in the Midwest where we actually lack that rich topsoil because we're losing it due to erosion. So that's why it's important we talk about regenerative ag, right? If we don't have that topsoil, we're not going to be able to feed that 9.7 billion people that is expected to be here by 2050. So when they asked me to speak on regenerative ag, and I was thinking about how I was going to pose this, I started looking at it and I was like, well, gosh, this is a really big topic to handle, and there is a lot of information to cover into this. Are any of you guys doing regenerative ag today, or is it brand new? Pretty brand new? Cool, that'll be fantastic. Then you guys, I can kind of indoctrinate you, right? So the 4 primary components of this regenerative ag is nutrient management, so trying to get our roots to grow about as big of a base as possible, as well as preserving our soil nutrients, talking about conservation practices, so no-till or even strict-till, because I know in some cases doing an absolute no-till can be incredibly hard to do. And then cover cropping and biodiversity, these two are really going to tie into each other. You're going to hear the same messaging throughout those. So when we look at the benefits of regenerative ag, right, this is why we're saying regenerative ag could be a tool in the toolbox to help us recover some of that topsoil that we've lost and also be able to productively feed that 9.7 billion people. So the first one is that improvement of microbial soil communities. And we already said that there's over 1 billion different microbes in that teaspoon of soil. But in some of these soils, we don't have that many. And they're important because they're actually going to help that soil nutrient recycling process. Because surely the government and they're not monitoring our phosphorus and our nitrogen, are they? Yeah, that's definitely something that's important, especially as we look towards the future with those type of government regulations, is how can we recycle those nutrients that are already existing in our soil so we can do more with less and fall within those guidelines. The second one is creating better soil media and aggregates. So this is where it falls into no-till or strip-till. Because what happens is if we don't have those soil aggregates and we disc it into a really, really fine powder, it doesn't give us great soil structure for water to be able to seep through that and to be stored in that. And I don't know about you guys, but where I live up by Brunswick, Nebraska, we were negative 12 inches of water for the year. We were pretty dry. And then the last one is the greenhouse gas emissions. Have you guys heard any legislation or news media coming about greenhouse gas emissions as it relates to farming? So it's coming. So in Canada, they've actually reduced the amount of nitrogen you can apply because they're trying to reduce some of these greenhouse gas emissions. So there's ways to proactively manage this with some of our cover crops and our soil structure and the amount of output we can grow with our crops and the inputs that we supply with them. So the first one that I wanted to talk about was actually understanding your nutrient systems and making sure that we're growing those roots to a maximum size or capacity that we can in that soil. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is understanding your soil tests. So have you guys done your agronomy soil testing piece yet? Not yet. Cool. What about you guys? Do you guys look at your own soil tests or do you guys give them? You guys give them to your field agronomist? Yep. So this is where I really love the part of the soil chemistry, right? And this is crucial to understanding how our ground is working and interacting with our crop and the soil. So the first one I like to look at is understanding your phosphorus tests. So if you ever look at them, there's going to be a column labeled P1 and P2. Does anybody know the difference between those two? So P1 is labeled as that's what's truly crop available. P2 is that's the total amount of phosphorus that you have within your soil, but it's unavailable to the crop. So that means there's a tie-up in that system somewhere. You have it there, the crop just can't access it. The other one that I want to talk about is organic matter, because the more organic matter that we have, the more of these soil microbes that can nutrient recycle, the more water holding capacity, so on and so forth. What is an average organic matter for you guys over here? It's been a minute. So when I was doing field agronomy, I worked around the Hartwell, Minden, Nebraska area, and a really, really good organic matter level there was like 2%, which is still pretty low. If we could get those up to like 2.5%, 3.5%, 4%, we'd be sitting pretty high and mighty. That would be really good numbers. But it's good question. You're beating me to the punch, but I'll answer it now. So he asked, what are growers actually using when they're baling corn stalks? They're losing a lot. If you look at your grain stover removal rates, it's a lot, right? And it's probably, when you sell those, you're probably not recouping the actual cost of the nutrients that you're removing off of that field. So yeah, we're gonna delve into that here in a little bit. Great. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It takes, and I mean with cash renting especially, if you're removing all of that stover and the organic matter residue that's on top of that soil, we have better hope that nutrient prices go down the next year to be able to overcome all of that we just took off. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute too. So all of those things and that stover, as it breaks down, as we have those microbial communities, that'll actually tie back into our organic matter levels. So we really need it there for multiple different pieces. pH and CEC, these are two other really big components that can interact with how nutrients live within our soil. So if your pH is below 6.2 or above 6.8, phosphorus is tied up. So you can be putting 150, 200 pounds down of phosphorus every year, but if your pH is out of whack, it's not going to be crop available. So these are just really interesting things that when you're having your conversations with your retail agronomists, make sure you're asking them about these and how it's going to affect your fertilizer applications in the next year, so you can, your pH ideal would be around that like 6.8 range. Yep. Yep, that's before you add anything to it. Yeah, yep, between 6 and 7 is going to be really the sweet spot. Your micronutrients are more available below that 6.2, but we typically add some of those with some of our macro fertilizers. And above that 7.2, 7.4 is when some of our other nutrients start to get tied up. So 6 to 7 is a really good spot to be in. How many of you guys have heard the buzz around biological products? You guys? Okay. Biological products. Anything? So this is something that when you talk to your retailers, everybody is talking about biologicals, and they're trying to figure out how we can make this work appropriately, right? And that's part of my job in my normal day-to-day, is to help some of these retailers figure out what and the why, so we're not putting down wasted dollars, right? We want to make sure that if you guys are investing your money, it needs to be going to the right spot. So part of that is having your agronomists or your retailers understand what those biologicals and the sources of biologicals are actually doing for the soil. And then residue management, you beat me to that one, taking the residue off the field, and then cover cropping, grazing, and termination of those. Anybody doing cover cropping in here? Go. Say it again. So his question was, cover cropping, it does cost money to get those seeds in, right? And he's worried about taking money off of the bottom line. So we're going to talk about that, because there are some benefits as we're converting to some of these conservation practices where it can actually be beneficial, and there's government programs like through the NRCS where they'll actually fund you money to put in the cover crops. So this is the soil bacteria dive-in piece, and where I was saying talk to your agronomists, talk to your retailers to make sure you guys are actually understanding what that biological is meant to do, because realistically they fall into 4 different categories. So the first one is the decomposers, which is when you would want to use it if you have a field that has a lot of residue and a lot of stover left over and it's just not breaking down very fast. that's when you want to introduce some of those decomposers, because those are going to break down all those starches and those lignins and convert it actually into the soil organic matter. So instead of taking that off, this can break it down and incorporate it into your soils. So the best application with that is probably going to be the fall, right? Because it needs some time to work on that and to actually break it down before you're going to see that residue break down by spring or summer. So the mutualistic, those are the ones that are going to have a benefit with what's already happening in your soil. So these would be like your azospirillum, and these are fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere. So just like soybeans do with their nodules, some of these biologicals can do that same thing with your grass crops, like your wheat, your sorghum, your milo, your corn. So that would be something that we would actually look at doing in seed inoculants, in furrow applications. There's a couple of different ways we can get those out there. And then obviously like the bacillus bacteria, some of those rhizobium, they actually fix nitrogen for our legume crops. So think alfalfa, soybeans, if you're doing any peas, and those are generally seed treatments. Would cover crops take a lot of moisture? So I'll skip a little bit ahead and then I'll go back. So, just like he said, he was worried about water conservation with our cover crops. So there's different means to the madness, is what I like to say. It's all dependent on your goals. So if your goal would be to conserve water, we might look at doing something like a beet or a large tuber that's going to contain a lot of water. That way when we terminate it in the spring, as it breaks down, it's going to release some of that water back in. Because our goal with cover crops, if we're doing it for nutrient recycling, trying to save those nutrients from flushing through the soil, or to try and conserve water, we want to terminate those before they hit that reproductive stage. That way, as they decompose, they're going to release all of that in that 4 to 6 inches where they're living. So not all cover crops are going to be created equally, and that's where we start getting into the different blends. Yep. Seed corn. Yeah, interseeding. Wow. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, it's all dependent on what you're trying to accomplish with it. So with those seed cover acres, they're using radishes, and that's probably as a means to either break up some compaction or just trying to conserve that water and let it come back and break down over time. But it doesn't mean that every single blend needs to have radishes or turnips or any of those brassicas in it. It depends on what your goal is. So if you're fighting compaction, any of those big tuber crops are going to be great because as they grow, right, they swell and they bulge up and they break that compaction. So that way we have better soil aggregates. If you're looking for the nutrient scavenging, so if we have a corn crop, we get some rain and it leaches some of those nitrates down, even some of those like turnips, vetches, that's actually going to pull those back up. And then when we terminate the crop, as they decompose, it's going to release those nutrients back into the soil. So that's what we call nutrient scavenging. Livestock guys? Any of you guys livestock guys? Kim is, yes. So that's where we would look at maybe doing a blend, right? The turnips, the radishes, some of these grasses, ryegrass, oats, things like that. And with doing your livestock grazing on that, cattle, right, are going to consume that and they're going to utilize those nutrients. Well, it's also going to come out of the back end, right, too? So it's keeping your fertilizer still in your field. And then just like we talked before, the NCRS and the CSP, there's a program called EQIB, that'll actually provide funds to growers for putting in cover crops for their fields. And then if you're looking, because that's a lot of information, right? How do you decide what is going to be the right cover crop blend for your acres? And this is where I really point people is to some of these specialists, right? They have pre-mixed blends, or you can talk to them directly and they can help you figure out what's your goal. Here's the blend that's going to be the best for you. Are you guys all from the York area? Oh, very good. Fantastic. So these are three that are pretty well spaced out. You've got one up in Orchard that's kind of from around my neck of the woods. You've got the one in Bladen, which they are fantastic. And then if you're further north, there's some up in Brookings. Surely these are not all of them, but these are three that I've worked with in the past. And then we're going to go back just a little bit. Did I get all of your questions answered on the cover crops? For now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you have a drill. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and there's tools. I'm not a great equipment person. I'll tell people that all day. I like agronomy and I like soil science, but I am not your girl for equipment. But if you talk to your NRCS people, more than likely there's probably funds that are going to help you, A, purchase the cover crops, and then B, if you need to contract somebody to come in and actually input those, it should be able to cover some of that too. So my advice would be talk to your local conservation office or your farm program office, and they'll be able to help figure out what and where and when those funds are available. Cool. So I'm going to sneak back just a little bit. So when we talk about conservation tillage, what do you guys do today? No-till? Fantastic, no-till. You guys, same? That's okay. We're getting you educated. So no-till is going to be not necessarily putting any steel equipment in the ground, because we talked about this earlier, right? We lose 3 tons of soil per acre due to erosion. And tillage is needed in some areas, right? Not everything can be no-till, especially not right away. It's a long process. But the thought process behind converting to either strip till or no-till is all about microbial populations, right? We don't want to disrupt those because 99.9% of those are going to be friendly and advantageous to our soil systems and the way they interact with crops. The second reason is we don't necessarily want to break down all of those clods in the soil, because that is what's allowing water and air to be absorbed within that soil. And that also gives us really nice pockets for our roots to go into and to take up some of those nutrients. Did you guys know that potassium moves with the soil water? It does. Write that one down. So soil water moves potassium. So if you apply potassium and we have a drought and it's a really, really heavily tilled soil and it's not absorbing any of the rainfall that we do get, your crops cannot take up that potassium because it has to move with the soil water. So that's why these soil aggregates and those pore spaces within the soil are incredibly important. So strip till is probably the next step if you're going from a regular tillage program and you don't have no-till. Strip till is probably the intermediary step to that, because we're not going to be able to eliminate all of those problems in day one, are we? How long of a road was it for you to get to your no-till? Your intermediate. Very good. That's awesome. How about you guys? How long did it take? A couple of years?
I ran it out 2013. It was about 2 years.
Yep, 2 years. Yeah, so converting to no-till is not a next year process. This takes probably at least 3 years, right? Because there's things that we have to consider, like what is our weed pressure out in those fields? Do those fields already have some existing compaction? And what crops can I grow on those fields, right? So if we're converting a conventional tilled soil into a no-till, some things to think about outside of that is I would probably start with some type of a legume like a soybean or an alfalfa. They're pretty hardy, right? They can get down there and grow some decent roots and try and fight some of that compaction. What do you think?
What about if you had a CRP in it and then put corn in it? Would that work very good?
CRP into corn. That one's a tough one because grasses are the same mode of action as your corn crop is. So I would probably like to see a soybean in there first and then into a corn crop. Yeah. Yeah, the soybeans are really hardy and they can get in there and kind of break some of that up if it's a tight soil, and then they're much better scavengers than our corn crop. Our corn crop is kind of lazy. We gotta make it easy on it. And then when we look at some of our other things when we're converting to no-till, is that applications of nutrients might not always be easy. So you'll see some of these Montag strip tiller machines out there, right? And that's just to put banded placement of that fertilizer right next to the root. So that way those crops, like our corn crop that's kind of lazy, it can reach those nutrients a little bit faster. I think that's all I have on no-till. Do you guys have any advice? No. A+. No. So your nitrogen will scavenge most nitrogen because it will produce some of its own. The thing to be cognizant of is if you hit over probably 70 to 75 bushel beans, it's actually scavenging nitrogen from your soil. And you're probably not getting as big of a nitrogen credit as what we'd like to think.
I think you're talking about irrigated beans when you're talking soil.
Dryland beans, yes. Dryland beans, they're probably going to be A-okay for not necessarily taking nitrogen out of the cropping system. They're probably fixing all of their own. Phosphate is a big thing because it moves with soil particles. So if we have a true conservation or a true tillage practice farm and a windstorm comes through and it blows it off, that's one way that we can lose our phosphorus. And then number two, when we were talking about pH and soil organic matter, those are two other really big keys that can influence our phosphorus. So if our soil pH is out of whack, we're probably going to have to overcompensate and put a little more fertilizer down, or we have to find a way to release that phosphorus that's already tied up in the soil. Did that answer your question okay?
Yeah, I guess so.
60 pounds. Yeah. And so if we can find a way to scavenge some of that before the next crop is planted, that's where we implement a lot of those cover crops. And then you kill it off in the spring before you go in and plant your next crop of corn, probably. And then that way all of your nitrates are within reach of those corn soil roots. All right. So these are just some interesting numbers. I'll be interested to hear if you guys have also seen this on your farms that you've converted to no-till. So the left hand is a true tillage practice farm, right? The right is where they've converted to no-till practices. So the organic matter, this is obviously not in Nebraska because I said 2.5 to 3 would be really good organic matter numbers for most of us here. The true tillage here was 4. In the no-till situation, it was 5.4%. So those no-till practices actually increase the organic matter by nearly 1.5%, which is fantastic. And then the decomp rate, when we were talking about removing stover and all that corn crop residue that likes to sit on the top, but if it doesn't decompose quickly, that's a problem too, right? So by introducing some of these no-till practices and improving the biological communities in there that can decompose that, it went up from 3% to 8.9%. So it more than doubled the rate of decomposition of some of those residues that we have left over on our soils. And then you have other things like nitrogen and then the protein that you can find in that soil that then relates into our crops. Oh my, guys, you guys are good conversers. We're almost out of our time. So when we talk about terminating the cover crops, right, because that's also a really important part, because if it goes to reproduction stages, then all of those nutrients and the water that it's used up during that time frame are then going to be stuck in that fruit, right? Whether that's the tuber, whether that's the rye head, whatever it might be. So we always want to make sure that we're terminating it before it gets to that later reproductive stage. And some ways of doing that is chemically, right? We can go in and spray a Gromoxone or a Roundup application and burn that down. This is something that my neighbor is actually pretty big into regenerative ag, and I said, Zach, what would you like to learn more about if you were to listen to this type of a talk? And he goes, well, I've heard about roller crimpers, and I want to know more about how they work. So this is going to be a new way to try and terminate some of those grass, those rye cover crops. And what it's basically doing is it's rolling over the crop as it gets closer to reproductive, and it crimps it and it basically kills it off. It doesn't allow that crop to take up any more water. And then as the season goes along and those decomposer biologicals come into play and they decompose all of that water and those nutrients that crop has then taken up until this point then go back into the soil. Chemicals have... So he asked if there are anything that can replace Roundup yet because it's cost expensive. Not that I know of. There's other means out there, but I don't think that there's another new active ingredient, not that I can talk to. That might be a good question for your local agronomist. And then this is about the end of it, guys. This is just talking about, it's all about your goal. Not every acre is going to be able to take the same path that you guys might have taken into getting into this no-till practices, the regenerative ag cycle. But when we're looking at all of it, you might say, well, that's a lot of components. How are we supposed to measure that what we're doing is actually effective, right? What's the measure of success here? And there's a couple of different factors that we can look at. So one is called the Haney soil test, and this is literally a test that they can take and send into the laboratory, and it measures the rate of respiration of your soil. So all of those billion soil microbes, they're measuring how many are in there.
What about tile ground?
Tiling your water in your ground. So that's going to probably create a little bit of compaction at first, right? Because they really have to get it down in there. But if you have a excess water problem, it's a good means to move some of that off. I don't see a lot of it in Nebraska, but I do have friends in Iowa and Illinois that have quite a bit of tiled ground. That would be interesting. I definitely have to look more into that one. So getting those Haney tests done are going to be good means of measuring how healthy your soil is in respect to our soil microbes. And that's what's responsible for all of those nutrient turnover. And then if you guys want to learn more about that, this Lance Gunderson is his name. If you go onto YouTube, he actually has a really nice segment talking about the hows and the whys of this Haney test. And then there's always the visual and the physical properties. So if you guys go and you stick a shovel into your ground, right? And you're gonna look at some crop roots. Are the crop roots growing out and evenly? They're not having sidewall compaction. So that's one thing to look for. And if you dig, how many clods, dirt clods, more or less, do you have in that soil? Because realistically, the more aggregates or kind of those dirt clod looking things that you have, the more soil pores that you're gonna have, which is where the water and the air goes, which is also where our roots are able to pick up those nutrients. And then of course, earthworms. Earthworms are a really, really easy determination. If you have earthworms in your soil, odds are you've probably got a really pretty good, healthy soil. If you're putting on nitrogen, so it can make that zone where you put nitrogen on pretty acidic at some point. And I like to say soil microbes are kind of like me, right? I kind of like temperamental weather patterns, right? Most of the microbes like a pretty even pH, so around that 6 to 7. And then they also like soil temperatures around 55 to 70 degrees. So if you're using like anhydrous, that can create a really, really acidic pH zone, and it can kill off some of those soil microorganisms. So when I interact with producers that are using anhydrous, I say if you can, put a biological in with your starter application to re-encourage that flush of soil microbes. And it's really, really, you can't sterilize the soil, so it'll be okay. So guys, when we're looking at all of these factors put together, right? You said it earlier, well, this is all pretty costly, right? How does this not impact my bottom line? How do I make this a positive thing for myself? And there's a lot of programs out there. This is becoming something of note through the government structures, through our local structures. And you can see on this slide here, Cargill, you guys recognize that name, right? Bayer, Pepsi. All of these guys are jumping on the regenerative ag bandwagon, more or less to speak. And they are really encouraging this to be the future of agriculture because there's safer practices, they're more environmentally friendly practices, and that's ultimately at the end of the day what our consumers at the grocery store are wanting. And so Cargill, Pepsi, Bayer, all these companies are actually offering programs and payment programs to you guys to start implementing some of these practices. So that's one. Syngenta, you guys recognize that name, right? The Syngenta group is doing something similar, and so is Bayer. So if you Google regenerative agriculture or carbon programs, you're gonna see a lot of these pop up, and those are all resources for you guys to use to help cover some of the costs of either application of the cover crops, some of the termination of the cover crops, whatever that might be. And then here's some local resources outside of some of those corporate companies. There is a group called Regenerate Nebraska, and that's a group of growers that have really started to get into the regenerative ag, cover cropping, no-till practices, and they're great about helping new people into this new kind of structure of growing. And then SARE, Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. This Regen Lab is the lab that Lance Gunderson runs, and he's the one that does all of the work on that Haney soil test. And then the NRCS, I would really encourage you guys to talk to your local office and see if they have funds available to help out with any cover cropping needs or getting you pointed in the right direction of which blends are going to be the best for what you guys are trying to accomplish for each individual field. And then this is a bunch of resource to say that I didn't just make all this stuff up. This is a really, really exciting new face of farming, right? We're recuperating that organic matter, that topsoil that we've lost. Because if you guys remember, there is a third of the world's farmland is highly degraded. So some of these practices with regenerative agriculture are helping recuperate for that. But it is a lot of information, so I always encourage people to maybe start with one of the 4 primary categories and and that's a great entryway in. And then you guys yourselves are great resources, the ones that have been through it and seen some of the side effects or things to watch out for, things to know when converting to no-till. Do you guys have any more questions today? Nothing. All right. Well, you guys were a great interactive audience. Thanks for coming and listening. And I'm going to stick around for most of the day between the CVA booth and the Rhodesian booth. So come find me if you guys want to talk a little bit more.